Good evening and welcome to Printers, Inc. Tonight we're very pleased to welcome author David Darlington, who will discuss his new book, Area 51, The Dreamland Chronicles. Area 51, also known as Dreamland, Paradise Ranch, and The Box, is the mysterious top-secret military installation located in the midst of the Nevada desert, funded by the U.S. government's $30 billion black budget. A bevy of speculations and legends have been offered to explain this notorious covert facility. Are aliens or UFOs being hidden within its confines? Is it the headquarters of a clandestine satellite government? On just what are the billions of dollars of our tax dollars being spent? Through eyewitness testimony, interviews, leaked documents, and personal observations, David Darlington has crafted a compelling account that answers boundless questions provoked by Area 51. Darlington skillfully portrays the landscape, people, and often outlandish ideas that surround Dreamland. At the same time, explores larger concerns about who controls our technologies and our government, and in whose interest. As Publishers Weekly observes, Darlington explains not only the history of Area 51, but the budgetary and political advantages of secrecy. Throughout, he brings a reporter's balanced eye to his material and to the people involved, so that believers and skeptics alike should take to his account. Critically acclaimed author David Darlington has written 3 previous books, The Mojave, In Condor Country, and Angel's Visits. Would you please join me in welcoming David Darlington?
Thank you. Which one of these? I guess it doesn't matter. It's a parabolic situation. Thank you for coming. Interesting that we're being filmed here by C-SPAN. I didn't know that was going to happen, but we do have some congressional issues to discuss, so that'll be great. I'm just kind of curious sometimes about people in the audience, and one thing I wonder is, has anybody here ever been to Area 51? In what capacity? Directly over it?
No.
What do you mean?
I knew it when I saw it.
What?
I knew it when I saw it.
What, you're a pilot?
No, just a passenger in an airplane.
Okay, so flying off to the side of it, I guess. Yeah, it's, supposedly if you fly over Area 51, you can be shot down. Unless you turn around. There was a story at one point that some people on a round the world or cross-country weather balloon were being blown by the wind directly toward Area 51, and they were in danger of being shot down until the wind changed. So they lucked down. But we can discuss some more of those stories and concepts. Anybody else been to Area 51 or nearby? You've been to Rachel, yeah. Okay, Rachel is the little town that is the nearest town to Area 51. It has 100 citizens. No post office, no bank, no brothel, which is a big deal in Nevada. Brothels are illegal in Lincoln County, which is the county that Area 51 is part of. But anyway, I'm going to, I think, just read the prologue of the book, which is called Millennial Nightmares. And then I'll maybe discuss a little bit of background and see how the time goes. Sometimes I read another section about a guy named Bob Lazar. Next question, how many people here have heard of Bob Lazar? Ah, a goodly number, okay. Well, maybe you don't need to hear that part. So I'll read the prologue and then talk a little bit and see how the time goes. It started with the Cold War. Not only Area 51, the black budget, and the CIA, but all the business about flying saucers. When an Idaho pilot named Kenneth Arnold saw 9 objects in the sky near Mount Rainier, Washington on June 24, 1947, and a mysterious craft came down on a ranch near Roswell, New Mexico 1 week later, it marked the opening of an era, one ushered in through channels both scientific and psychological by the atomic bomb. I'm not referring to the mere fact of the sightings themselves. As any UFO book will eagerly tell you, records of unexplained airborne objects can be traced back to ancient times, popping up throughout the history of art and religion. Nor do I mean the recent rash of alien abduction stories, which have plenty of predecessors in folk tales about fairies and goblins. I'm talking about the modern relationship between these things and technology, specifically a type of technology that can destroy the world, and the culture of secrecy that it created. The Cold War justified the dangerous urge of a democratic government to hide its workings from the public. In the process, it convinced American citizens that the government was hiding its workings from them. This destruction of mutual trust was intrinsic to the way in which the flood of UFO sightings that followed World War II was handled, both by the government and by the citizens. Though whether the bomb and the specter of communism actually made people see flying saucers is not a question I'm prepared to answer. Could the phenomenon itself have been physically triggered by atomic explosions? Was some kind of metaphysical intelligence disturbed by the path that Homo sapiens was taking? Might actual extraterrestrial beings have been attracted to Earth by sudden flashes appearing over interstellar distances? Or was the collective terrestrial imagination simply so traumatized by the technopolitics of the time that it responded hysterically, conjuring visions of alien intruders? Much psychological analysis has been applied to the science fiction films of the 1950s. Invasion of the Body Snatchers that came from outer space, which we are told served as a pressure valve for Cold War tensions, portraying an incomprehensible enemy that threatened everything Americans held dear. But what about the parallel fact that the real-life human witnesses of the time, George Adamski, Truman Bethurum, Orfeo Angelucci, and George Van Tassel, people who claim to have had actual contact with extraterrestrials, described the visitors as a kind of cross between Mahatma Gandhi and Marilyn Monroe? Kind, wise, beautiful, and blonde. Or the subsequent reversal that as time went on, the cinematic aliens became friendly, if still ugly, E.T. and his ilk, while the real-world tales turned terrifying, with bizarre sexual experiments being conducted in antiseptic laboratories. Or that now, with the likes of Saddam Hussein playing the boogeyman role vacated by the Soviets, and a CIA veteran ceding the presidency to a ravenous baby boomer, united across their generations by Yale degrees. Our most popular on-screen entertainments are the sinister conspiracies of the X-Files and a 4th of July showdown between all-consuming extraterrestrials and a spineless young chief executive who is nevertheless a veteran combat pilot. Calling shots from the most top-secret research site of the Cold War era. With this as our celluloid sublimation, are the real-life stories about to resume an aspect of reassurance? The answer depends on who you talk to. I'm in contact with certain authorities who insist there is no cause for consolation. Some believe that extraterrestrials on the downside of an evolutionary curve are here for our DNA. Others deny that the creatures in question come from outer space at all. Rather, they are being manufactured in Frankenstein factories at Area 51, the secret, though celebrated, government installation at Groom Dry Lake in southern Nevada, as part of an elaborate hoax designed to enslave the world population before a bogus extraterrestrial threat. Still others straddle the fence between these anxious positions, combining them with the conviction that mass mental slavery is indeed the aim of an evil Illuminati. The validity of these viewpoints is, in my opinion, undercut by the fact that the people who hold them are deeply disturbed. With the help of ostensibly more level-headed researchers, however, I have assembled a less sensational, if equally incredible, story. The popular intelligence, as advanced by the movie Independence Day, holds that alien corpses and technology from Roswell are being housed at Area 51. According to my sources, this claim is false. The discs came not from Roswell, but from a crash near Kingman, Arizona. And they've been housed not at Groom, but Papoose Lake, also known as Area S4, south of Area 51. Actually, there is little likelihood that the material is even at S4 anymore, now that so much attention has been directed to that region. Since 1953, the satellite government outside the control of Washington, D.C., has pursued this matter in a secret program, which may or may not be descended from the fabled Majestic 12 Committee, allegedly mandated by President Truman. Headquartered at Los Alamos, New Mexico, directed in part by Dr. Edward Teller, and created by then Vice President Richard Nixon. Moreover, this program has been conducted not by our species alone, but with the limited cooperation of extraterrestrial biological entities, EBEs, from the Zeta Reticuli star system, who incidentally are not slimy and reptilian, but answer to the classic description of the typical gray alien. Hairless and roughly 4 feet tall, with big, dark, wraparound eyes. For reasons not yet fully explained, these beings have a pressing need for the element boron, which is found throughout the American Southwest. This fact, together with the concentration of top-secret military facilities in that part of the country, partly explains why so much UFO activity has been reported there. There is some speculation that a deal was struck between the visitors and the U.S. government, allowing the extraction of boron in exchange for advanced technology. But this allegation extends beyond the knowledge of my sources. Neither can they confirm or deny the existence of underground installations linked by an extensive tunnel system, much less stories of subterranean vats containing human body parts, which, in light of the alien abduction trend, have arisen from the charge, also unconfirmed by my informants, that the bargain involves human research specimens. This is the basic outline of the scenario that my contacts have been scrutinizing. Some of it is based on the testimony of a disreputable young technician who claims to have been employed in the secret program. More of it comes from a conservative elderly engineer who says he worked for 30 years in the satellite organization and purportedly has the permission of his supervisors to begin discussing details of the experience. This man's background is itself somewhat murky. As might be expected, one must acknowledge, of someone who has spent half his life in such a covert endeavor. His name, however, is not a secret. He's a frequent speaker at UFO conventions and symposia, where he usually ranks as the most down-to-earth participant among a fraternity of fantastic theorists, radical researchers, and out-and-out charlatans. These gatherings, which tend to celebrate the elopement of stridency and gullibility, provide forums for people with big answers to confront people with big questions. Invariably, they anticipate that some very big news is going to be revealed in the very near future. My colleagues are disposed to distance themselves from this sort of thing. They don't consider themselves ufologists so much as amateur detectives with eccentric interests. Wary of obsession or conversion, they try not to identify too much with the mystery that they're pursuing, making it a constant exercise, for example, to employ the term folklore. Like the reality of flying saucers themselves, which despite widespread testimony remains unaccompanied by physical proof, the question of whether this tale is true or has somehow been summoned up from a labyrinth of psychosocial forces is not one that my sources are prepared to answer. Everybody seems to agree, however, that it's a heck of a yarn. As the team leader himself has said, all we're looking for is a good story, which is something so rare in this life that when one finally comes along, we wouldn't want to mess it up with evidence. One of the field's less reliable researchers recently announced that the next 18 months will be pivotal to execution of the hidden agenda. He predicts a paradigm shift for the year 1998, which when divided by the number of the Trinity equals the satanic figure 666. In other words, the cat's about to get out of the bag. It's time to surround ourselves with gold, guns, groceries, and God. With the approach of the year 2000, we can expect such revelations to rise like a lake full of hungry trout, rippling the surface of popular consciousness with expanding portents and prophecies. The Cold War might be over, but the millennium is about to arrive. And even if the culture of secrecy is under fire, paranoia is alive and well, holed up in the desert north of Las Vegas under an assumed name, Dreamland. I think actually what I'll do is I'm going to read a little bit of the next first chapter, which is called Freedom Ridge. That was the prologue, and now begins the Dreamland Chronicles, which, since you are the select few here tonight, I'll divulge, was my title for the book. Area 51 got slapped on top of that by my publisher for obvious reasons of wanting to tell people what it was about. But anyway, just before the first chapter, I quote from a poem by Edgar Allan Poe, which coincidentally is called Dreamland. By a route obscure and lonely, haunted by ill angels only, where an eidolon named Night on a black throne reigns upright. I have reached these lands but newly from an ultimate dim Thule, from a weird clime that lieth sublime, out of space, out of time. For the heart whose woes are legion, 'tis a peaceful, soothing region. For the spirit that walks in shadow, 'tis an El Dorado. But the traveler traveling through it may not, dare not, openly view it. Never its mysteries are exposed to the weak human eye unclosed. So wills its king, who hath forbid the uplifting of the fringed lid, and thus the sad soul that here passes beholds it but through darkened glasses. One day in October 1993, I left my home in Northern California and drove east through the Great Central Valley, through the burnished Gold Rush foothills, past the polished granite of Yosemite, over the vertiginous Sierra Nevada crest, past the blue expanse of Mono Lake and streaked cinder slopes of its adjoining craters, through the forests that give way to sagebrush west of Benton Hot Springs, below cloud-capped Boundary Peak and the bristlecone-dotted White Mountains, and into that vast and vacant territory, that wide-open alternation of elevation and depression, that enormous interior drainage bowl of dry-like dotted desert, that congenitally uncontrolled kingdom which, despite being composed almost wholly of federal land and a vociferously patriotic American populace, hardly seems part of the United States. Realm of the pinyon pine and juniper, scourge of gamblers and 49ers, home to untamed Mustangs, unreined brothels, and unbridled atomic bombs. The fastest growing state in the Union, the Silver State, that sovereign state of mind called Nevada. The welcome sign to Tonopah High School said, "Home of the Muckers." East of town along US Highway 6 was the missile-flanked entrance to the Tonopah Test Range, from which squadrons of stealth fighters embarked for the Persian Gulf in 1990. The most common road sign contained the black silhouette of a prancing bull within the customary yellow diamond, underscored by the words, "Open Range." Wild horses gamboled on the plains. Fighter jets carved the sky with contrails. Mountains sucked streaks out of the clouds to pummel the darkened earth with storms. In places where rain had recently fallen, the surface of the two-lane blacktop steamed in the sun. Rainbows shimmered above shining mesas. The air was redolent of sage. As I turned south on Nevada 375 at Warm Springs, an unpeopled intersection with a collection of cottonwoods and an abandoned pool of hot water, I entered the fallout zone, the swath of the West that took the brunt of atmospheric testing in the 1950s, when nuclear bombs were detonated only if the wind was blowing this way. As I topped plutonium-tinged Queen City Summit and crossed the line between Nye and Lincoln counties, ahead and below in the gathering dusk, adjacent to an unnamed playa, I could see the scattered trailer homes that comprise the town of Rachel. Population 100, elevation 4,970 feet, established approximately 1978. Within the enormity of Sand Springs Valley, it looked like some research compound on a distant planet. Luckily, the red, white, and blue sign in front of the Little Ailey Inn said, "Earthlings welcome." I pulled into the parking lot and went inside the building, which was actually a double-wide house trailer. The only people in the room were a stout, pretty, dark-haired barmaid and a guy in a baseball hat who was playing the slot machine. The jukebox had a few recent pop tunes, augmenting its staple diet of Hank Williams, Dolly Parton, Merle Haggard, and Randy Travis. The walls were decorated with pictures of fighter planes from nearby Nellis Air Force Range, little gray aliens with big dark eyes, and local terrestrial luminaries, the science buff Bob Lazar, the pilot John Lear, the TV reporter George Knapp, the radio host Anthony Hilder, the funeral director Norio Hayakawa, and the self-proclaimed world's foremost UFO researcher, Sean David Morton, who was shown meditating beneath a pyramid. T-shirts, bumper stickers, and U.S. Geological Survey maps of the area were for sale. On one wall was a 6-foot panoramic photo of the secret base at Area 51, located 25 miles to the south. There was also an extensive library containing books and magazines and a stack of binders. Most of this was the property of one Glenn Campbell, not the noted pop country troubadour, who spells his name with only one N. I asked the guy in the baseball cap if he'd ever been near the secret base. He said that one night when he was drunk, he'd crossed the boundary and been caught by the guards, but they decided to let him go. He showed me a copy of a form he'd signed, admitting that what he'd done was illegal and subject to a $500 fine. I went back outside and drove half a mile down the road to another trailer whose sign said Area 51 Research Center. The yard was filled with cacti, cattle skulls, a miniature windmill, a pair of plastic Smoky Sam rockets, and a piece of airplane fuselage bearing the letters AF-51. A camper was parked in the driveway, and a bald, mustachioed man in his 30s was out in front. This was Glenn Campbell, whose voice betrayed Northeastern roots when he said, "Welcome to Rachel." I had phoned Campbell ahead of time to tell him I was coming. I'd never met him, but knew him as the author of the Area 51 Viewer's Guide, a collection of information about the base and region, beginning with commonly asked questions such as, what is the best time to look for flying saucers? And what will happen if I intrude into the restricted zone? And continuing with advice to visitors, a mile-by-mile guide to points along Highway 375, and meditations on everything from local government to extraterrestrial intelligence. I'd learned about Area 51 at a cocktail party a few months earlier. At the time, I was working on a book about the Mojave Desert. One of its chapters concerned a structure in California called the Integratron, which has served as a focal point for the UFO craze of the 1950s. When I mentioned this at the party, the woman asked if I knew about Rachel and the Little Alien. I soon learned that the town, the bar, and the base had been featured on A Current Affair, in the Los Angeles Times, even in Business Week, in an article entitled, "Little Gray Men Made My Eyes Turn Red." Within the next few months, the subject would also find its way into the New York Times Magazine and onto the cover of Popular Science. And within a couple of years, it would be investigated on 60 Minutes, portrayed in the movie Independence Day, and chosen as the location for a 3-hour UFO special on Larry King Live. There wasn't much consistency to these dispatches, some of which focused on flying saucers, while some didn't mention UFOs at all, choosing instead to dwell on issues involving government secrecy. But there seemed to be something here for everybody, all piqued by the allure, in the words of the Times, of a base so secret that it doesn't exist. As I pieced it together over time, the outline of the overall story went like this. Area 51 was located next door to the Nevada test site, where the government had experimented with nuclear bombs since 1951. Although it has never appeared on aviation charts or U.S. Geological Survey maps, the base was built in the mid-50s alongside Groom Lake, a remote playa ringed by parched mountains, for the U-2 spy plane. After Francis Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union in 1960, the place continued to serve as the test site for black budget or secretly funded intelligence and defense projects, including the A-12 and SR-71 Blackbirds, the F-117 stealth fighter, and a rumored hypersonic spy plane called the Aurora. For decades, it was known to insiders as Watertown Strip or the Ranch, to aircraft buffs and military pilots as Dreamland or the Box. The latter names referring respectively to the call sign of its control tower and its off-limit status on aeronautical maps. Even Nellis fighter pilots taking part in red flag war games were grounded and interrogated if they overflew the restricted airspace. The base had also reportedly been used for Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, research and NASA and commando training, which combined with the Nellis aeronautical activity sometimes rendered the local night skies a virtual fireworks display of flashing and streaming lights. Unmarked 737 flights from Las Vegas, 100 miles to the south, and Palmdale, California, location of the Skunk Works, headquarters for Lockheed Advanced Development Projects, dispensed a daily workforce of between 1,000 and 2,000 employees who were required to sign security oaths prohibiting them from even mentioning the place. Violations subject to 10 years in jail and a fine of $10,000. In 1984, without the required approval of Congress, the Air Force seized control of 89,000 acres of public land around the base to prevent people from coming near it. This inspired a series of hearings in Washington, D.C., during which the Air Force representative, John Rittenhouse, told the chairman of the House Subcommittee on Lands and National Parks, Representative John Seiberling of Ohio, that he could explain the reasons for the withdrawal only in a closed briefing. When Rittenhouse said that the decision to take the land had been made at a higher level than his, Cyberling responded that there is no higher level than the laws of the United States, signifying in the minds of some that Area 51 was outside the control of the U.S. government, and by extension, the American people. The controversy was exacerbated by the Air Force's ongoing refusal to acknowledge the existence of any military facility in the area. The intrigue escalated to a new and different level in 1989, when an obscure Las Vegas technician named Bob Lazar appeared on a local television news show and claimed that on the recommendation of Edward Teller, the so-called father of the hydrogen bomb and chief proponent of Star Wars defense technology, he had been hired to work at Area 51. Lazar said that when he reported to the base, he was taken in a bus with blacked-out windows to another smaller playa called Papoose Lake, S4 in alleged classified parlance, where he learned that his task was to research the propulsion systems of recovered alien spacecraft. With disarming lucidity, Lazar delivered a detailed recital of a fantastic story, touching off a frenzy in the UFO subculture. Seekers from around the world soon began making pilgrimages to Rachel, where they gathered at a black mailbox in the desert south of town, near the spot on Highway 375, where Lazar said he'd taken his friends to watch flight tests of the spacecraft on Wednesday nights, a misstep that supposedly led to his severance from the program. Quick on the uptake, the Rachel Bar and Grill expeditiously renamed itself the Little Alien, declaring its candidacy as Mecca to UFO believers. Meanwhile, back in Washington, D.C., a class action suit was filed, alleging that Area 51 employees had sustained long-term health damage from toxic materials illegally burned in open pits at the base. Claiming that any disclosures about classified activities would jeopardize national security, the government declined to address the charges, adding yet more acetylene to the inferno. Unfortunately for the Air Force, its 1984 land withdrawal had neglected a promontory called Whitesides Mountain, an unobstructed viewpoint just outside the border of Area 51. Photos of hangars, runways, and towers at the non-existent base soon began appearing in magazines, as curious hikers and correspondents converged on the peak. A private enterprise called Secret Saucer Base Expeditions even offered guided tours, promising disclosure of previously withheld government information on extraterrestrials. Whenever people were at large in the area, operations at the base had to be delayed or canceled, playing havoc with operations. Hence, in 1993, the Air Force filed a new application for 4,000 more restricted acres, citing the need to ensure the public safety and safe and secure operation of activities in the Nellis Air Force Range complex. This time, watchdogs were waiting. Citizen Alert, an anti-nuclear organization in Reno and Las Vegas that had protested the earlier closure, and an ad hoc group called the Rural Alliance for Military Accountability, lobbied against the new withdrawal. Proponents of the Neo-Sagebrush Rebellion, which holds that the federal government has no legal claim to Western lands, declared the proposal unconstitutional. Lincoln County, 99% of which is public property, and whose commissioners hadn't initially been notified of the plan, registered a formal protest. And citizen Glenn Campbell, lured by the legends, moved from his home in Boston to Rachel, where, operating from a corner table in the Little Ailey Inn, he set up the Secrecy Oversight Council and Whitesides Defense Committee, both of which consisted entirely of he, himself, and him. In the forays along the border that culminated in his viewer's guide, Campbell succeeded in becoming a good-sized thorn in the side of the government. He furnished visitors with directions to the border and counseled them about their rights if they were challenged. He tied ribbons around Joshua trees to mark the route up Whitesides Mountain. When those were removed, he spray-painted arrows on the rocks. And when those were eradicated, he replaced them with larger, more numerous ones. He dismantled motion sensors on public land along the Groom Lake Access Road, a buffer zone for the buffer zone, he charged, and published the arrival and departure times for the flights that shuttled workers to the base, as well as the radio frequencies used by the Groom Lake Air Control Tower, the security guards, and the Lincoln County Sheriff. In short, he pushed the jurisdiction of the government as far as he could within the limits of the law and framework of the Constitution. Most irksome of all to authorities, Campbell discovered an even better vantage point than Whitesides Mountain, a ridgeline only a dozen miles from Groom Lake, with a bleacher seat view of the base. In October 1993, he announced that he would lead a campout on this legal overlook, which he had christened Freedom Ridge. I had driven to Rachel in order to take part. So the rest of that chapter goes on to describe our hike to Freedom Ridge before it was closed, which it was, about a year later, after a couple of sort of cursory public hearings that were required by law. The first one took place in the county seat of Caliente in Lincoln County, and the second one was in Las Vegas, and that was quite a circus. I have a blow-by-blow description of both of those hearings in the book. That was where I came across a guy named Anthony Hilder, who is a radio talk show host and conspiracy theorist and sort of expert on the New World Order, which you may or may not know is the clandestine cabal and conspiracy that is, as he puts it, planning to take away everything we have. He says that Area 51 is a sort of nexus for their operations and claims that, among other things, they have a Frankenstein factory where they are bioengineering sort of quasi or faux extraterrestrials for the purpose of freaking us all out. But he is only one of many colorful characters that I came in contact with, and as I went on to research this book, I originally took this trip to Freedom Ridge that I just described, or just introduced, for my book on the Mojave Desert. But once I got there and spent a month or two researching this subject, I realized that it was much too big and complex to be just part of one chapter in a book about the desert, that it really deserved a whole book on its own. And so as soon as I finished the Mojave, I set right to work on this book. Essentially what I've tried to do is give a compilation of information about the base and its history to the extent that it's known. The next chapter after Freedom Ridge is called Paradise Ranch, and that was the name that Kelly Johnson applied to Area 51. Kelly Johnson was the head of Skunk Works, which is the legendary experimental arm of Lockheed, which developed the U-2 and the A-12 Blackbird and the Stealth Fighter, all of which were tested and housed at Area 51 before they were made publicly known. And basically what the situation with the base is that it was built in 1955 by the CIA specifically for the U-2. And after that, it was basically, I think, known mostly to a sort of select coterie of aviation buffs, people who followed aerospace technology and secret airplanes, knew that there was this place in the Nevada desert at Groom Lake, which was where these things were tested. But gradually over time, there developed rumors of flying saucers that had been seen around the base or in that area, or that people had seen things inside the base. Stories, and a number of them are cataloged here. Stories like, a worker at the base went into a hangar by mistake where he wasn't supposed to be, and he saw a disc hovering, 3 feet off the ground. And the stories get wilder from there. Another one that I heard was that a bunch of people were taken out to the Tonopah test range one day and were made to encircle a disc which suddenly disappeared before their eyes, and that they were guinea pigs in an experiment about perception of these things. But these stories kind of grew up over time, and one of the people, sort of one of the early people who promulgated a lot of these tales was John Lear, who was the son of William Lear, who invented the Lear jet. And John Lear is a very accomplished pilot in his own right. He holds a whole lot of speed records and all kinds of aviation licenses from the FAA, and he's flown a number of missions for the CIA. But apparently, sometime in the early to mid-'80s, he talked to some British military people who told him about a UFO landing that they had witnessed. And he began to look into this, and he became so avid about it that he became the sort of conduit for some of the most fantastic and horrifying stories about extraterrestrial visitors that I've ever heard. The ones that I referred to in the prologue about subterranean vats full of human body parts, things like that, those stories come from John Lear. Lear said that he was also the one who said that the visitors are on the downside of an evolutionary curve, and they're here for our DNA. One thing that they need is they combine human body tissue with peroxide, and they spread this on their own skin, and that preserves it. And this is related to the alien abduction stories that the government okayed, but it got out of control. It turned out that these things were not benign as the government believed, and there was a whole battle that took place underground at Dulce, New Mexico, which is a famous place for another underground site. All kinds of wild tales. Anyway, what eventually happened was Lear met this guy named Bob Lazar, who was a sort of obscure technician who had worked at Los Alamos and had moved to Las Vegas, where he had a photo processing business. And Lazar at first considered Lear to be a total crackpot, and Lazar was a real debunker of flying saucer stories. But in 1989, Lazar went on George Knapp's TV show and told the story that he had been hired to work at Area 51, and when he reported to work, he found that his job was to research the propulsion systems on recovered alien spacecraft. And he told such an amazingly detailed, vivid story that he immediately became a sort of cynosure to people from all over the world. And Lazar, he since produced his own videotape, which you can purchase. And it's been rumored for years that New Line Cinema was going to come out with a movie telling Bob Lazar's story, which would be a fantastic movie. But when some people started looking into Lazar's background after he went public like this, there were some things that kind of came up short. For example, he claims to have degrees in physics from MIT and Caltech, the two best engineering schools in the country. And when people consulted the admissions departments or the archives of those schools, there was no record of his attendance. Now, Lazar claims that his records were expunged after he told this story, after he went public. But some of these people, there's a whole group of people who study Area 51, and they call themselves the Interceptors. Now, I've become, in the course of my research, I've become a sort of honorary interceptor myself, as you can see from the patch that I have on my jacket. It says Dreamland Interceptors, Semper Suspiciere. But it's a group of actually very bright and down-to-earth people. These are the ones I referred to in the prologue as my colleagues, who basically are just so intrigued by these tales and had situations where they were able to not do anything else, that they just devoted their lives for a couple of years to doing nothing but studying Area 51 and all of these stories. The primary one is Glenn Campbell, who is probably really the central figure in this book, who is a very witty writer and published a newsletter called the Groom Lake Desert Rat, which I quote from pretty liberally in the book. Another one is Tom Mahood, who did a whole lot of detective work. He was a civil engineer in Orange County. He retired from his job when he was about 40 years old, and he devoted his time to studying Bob Lazar. And it turned out that that he found out that Lazar, well, after Lazar went public with all of this and became so famous, he was actually busted for pandering in Las Vegas. He admitted to being involved with a brothel. So he had court appearances, and those were public records. And Lazar's background was a public record as a result of these court appearances. So Tom went to the Clark County Courthouse in Las Vegas and started studying up on Lazar's background, where he learned that Lazar, for example, had at one time been married to 2 women simultaneously, one of whom killed herself 2 days after he married the other one. And he also owed a lot of people money. He had declared bankruptcy, and he had a lot of things in his background that made him seem like a pretty shady character. Now, all of this might be explained in a lot of ways, and one theory that was advanced by George Knapp, the TV reporter, who originally interviewed Lazar, was that maybe Lazar was handpicked by the people running this secret program for exactly this reason, that he was so disreputable that if he were to spill the beans, he could easily be discredited. Now, that's all well and good. That's a pretty good story, too. But it turns out that if you go to the most fundamental level of Lazar's story, which is physics, Lazar claims that he is a physicist, and he gives an explanation of what he found out about these craft and how they propel themselves through space, which basically says that there's an element numbered 115 on the periodic table, referring to the number of protons in an atom. It's higher than anything that we have on Earth. I think now our periodic chart goes up to 112, just recently. This is 115. He says that it emits gravity waves that extend beyond the perimeter of its atom, where they can be accessed and amplified in a reactor that's about the size of a basketball. And he gives a detailed description of what all this stuff looks like. And those waves can be focused on a distant point in space, and that they're so strong that they distort space and time at all points in between. So effectively, a craft can be pulled instantly and appear in another place with no passage of time, millions of miles away. Now, it's all tied up with Einstein's theory of relativity and things that I'm not very conversant on because I don't have a scientific background. But Tom Mahood, after giving up his career as a civil engineer, has since gone back to graduate school in physics. And he soon learned that I also had some physicist friends analyze this stuff with me. And if you apply, for example, the fundamental theory or the fundamental formula of E equals mc squared to the amount of matter in this element 115 that Lazar says each craft contained, you find that it's really, if it was totally converted to energy, a totally efficient reaction, it would give off enough power to run all the households in the United States for about a year and a half. Now that's pretty good, but it's still probably not enough to distort space and time over 200 trillion miles, which is the distance between here and the Zeta Reticuli star system, which is where Lazar says that these craft originated. So there's other things, too, that kind of don't hold water in Lazar's story. And at this point, he's been pretty well discredited. But he's sort of functioned as a, I say in the beginning of that chapter, I never met Lazar because he has a sort of a very obnoxious guy named Gene Huff, who is sort of his manager. And you have to go through Huff to get to Lazar. And Huff sort of makes a practice of blowing people off in a very rude manner. And he did that to me. So I never got to interview Lazar, but I say that, Lazar, meeting Lazar at this point would be kind of like meeting Bob Dylan. He's such a reclusive superstar and a legend in his own time that, you'd almost rather not meet him, but just sort of analyze his story from afar, which is what I did. But the interceptors also include a guy who calls himself Agent X. He's an ex-Coast Guard guy from Juneau, Alaska, who I spent a few days in the desert with, a sort of expert on secret aviation technology and freelance hustler, troubleshooter. I have a picture of him in the book here where we camped down on Delamar Dry Lake, and we did see some interesting things that night. There was 3 planes came over us really fast in the dark, and one of them had no lights at all. He said he'd never seen that before. Another one had a green diamond light pattern. He didn't know what that was. But I have a picture of him here.
standing in his camouflage garb on top of a Mustang Renault convertible, which is his vehicle of choice when he does his reconnaissance in the desert. He likes to, he says in Alaska, he ran for mayor of Juneau, and he said that his first act, because when he lost the election, he declared himself emperor of Juneau. His first act was to change the name of Juneau in the interest of honesty and accountability. He changed the name to Rain. So he says when he's in the desert, he rents convertibles so he can get as much sun as possible. An interesting thing has happened to him since. He's come down with a disease, and I forget the name of it, but all his hair has fallen out. It's very, very peculiar. But who knows why that might be. But that's not in the book because it's happened since the book was published. The picture right underneath that is this pyramid, is the Luxor Casino. How many people have been to Las Vegas here? The Luxor Casino is a big black pyramid with a sphinx down in front. And one of the chapters in the book takes place inside the pyramid, where Glenn Campbell kind of gave me a tour pointing out various points about Las Vegas culture. But taking off right in front of the pyramid is a Boeing 737 bound for Groom Lake. This terminal here is the McCarran Airport EG&G terminal, the company that used to run operations at the test site. And employees at Area 51 who live in Las Vegas park here and take these jets to Area 51, 100 miles to the north. But they're unmarked. They're called Janet flights, just as something might be called Southwest or TWA. But for a long time, in the early days of UFO interest in Area 51, these flights would come in at 4:45 in the morning, before dawn, and from the direction of Whitesides Mountain, which was the main viewpoint for UFO watchers, the thing would be coming in from the south, and it would appear to be totally stationary. It wasn't going sideways, it was coming right at you. So this big glowing light, a lot of people thought, they called it Old Faithful, and it was the morning UFO. But it turned out it was a Boeing 737. The interceptors there's a couple of guys who I call their elders, Jim Goodall and John Andrews. Andrews was the person who, 3 years before the stealth fighter was revealed by the government, Andrews designed a model toy of it and sold it to the Tester Toy Company. He and his friend Jim Goodall are experts on longtime watchers of secret aviation projects, and I have a long interview with them in the book. The longest chapter is probably called Lucifer Rising, which is a play on the last chapter of Arthur C. Clarke's book, 2010, which is called Lucifer Rising. It describes a UFO convention in the town of Rachel that I went to, which I got a great earful of conspiracy theories and learned a lot about the New World Order. And the other big UFO story in the book is told by a guy named Bill Uhouse. He's that elderly engineer I referred to in the prologue. The chapter is called A Higher Form of Hungarian, and this is the reference to the fact that Uhouse tells an involved story about his 30 years of employment in the secret satellite government, where he was supposed to help duplicate a flying saucer. And somebody asked him at one point how the aliens communicate among themselves, and he said, well, do you know what the most difficult language on earth is to learn? And someone said, Hungarian. And he said, that's right. The aliens speak a higher form of Hungarian. And there's all kinds of theories and background for how this might have come about. Turns out that the Los Alamos scientists during the Manhattan Project, the Hungarian scientists, were fond of calling themselves Martians, which is a whole other story. But with all these fanciful things, there are some pretty serious issues involved with the base. Basically, the fact that it's funded by what we call the black budget, which is a secret program for technology and intelligence and defense spending. Only a very select number of people in Congress know the funds and what they're going toward. Most Congress members and American taxpayers have no idea how much money is even going into these secret programs, much less what the programs themselves are. And there have been estimates made of this over the years that are basically done by subtracting the amount of known expenditures from the total budget. And it's come out to lately, over the last decade or so, it's been in the neighborhood in the mid $30 billion range per year. There's been one estimate that Area 51 itself cost $1 billion a year just to run the base. And there's a lot of tales of extravagance among the military personnel who have run the place over time. There was one allegation that the bottled water bill for the base was $50,000 a month. But anyway, to me, the toxic waste suit, which has been in the news, you might have heard of it, it was thrown out of court. These people claim their health had been damaged by toxic burning, and 2 of them have since died. It was thrown out of court in Las Vegas after President Clinton signed an exemption excusing Area 51 from complying with environmental law because it would endanger national security. This was on 60 Minutes. Now, of course, they didn't call it Area 51 in the exemption because they still don't admit that there is such a base as Area 51. They have gone so far now as to admit that there is what they call an operating location near Groom Dry Lake. But the case was appealed. It's now at the 9th Circuit District Court in San Francisco. And the first hearing, or the only hearing, took place about a month ago. And Jonathan Turley, the lawyer for the plaintiffs, got quite a, was really put through his paces by one of the 3 judges on the panel. And it looked like she was not much disposed to give his claims much credence, but or much weight. But whatever happens, and that decision should come down in the next month or 2, it's probably going to be appealed and go to the Supreme Court, because this question of whether a secret classified facility can basically hide allegations of environmental crimes or any kind of criminal activity, for that matter, under the cloak of national security is an important question. And it'll be interesting to see how the Supreme Court deals with it, which will probably happen sometime next year, I guess. I'll just close by saying that, to me, there are really 2 interesting topics. And I mean, there's a lot of interesting topics. You know, all the stuff about UFOs is fascinating, even if you don't believe that flying saucers exist or come from outer space. It's fascinating to me to consider implications that these stories have. You know, people are always speculating, why would these extraterrestrials come so far just to be around us? You know, what is it about human life that's so fascinating? Or just the physics of how something like that could happen. But also, even if you just consider it folklore, the most fascinating thing to me is the parallels between the flying saucer stories and the folklore and the Cold War itself. Because Area 51 itself is purely and simply an artifact of the Cold War. It was built for a spy plane to overfly the Soviet Union. And, you know, the Roswell story. The Roswell crash happened in 1947, which was the year of the CIA Act, when the black budget began. And at that time, Roswell was the headquarters for, I think, the 509th Bomber Wing, which was the only Strategic Air Command battalion of airplanes that were authorized to drop nuclear bombs. So those kind of parallels, to me, are fascinating. And I wish I could have gone into it more in the book than I actually did. But it's really a story about the paranoid mentality of the Cold War, I think. That's what Area 51 is all about, both on the inside and the outside. You know, paranoia, I think, created Area 51, continues to foster it, and also feeds the people outside the base who have so many fantastic theories for what's going on there. And they're allowed to have these fantastic theories by the fact that the government won't admit that there's anything there. So, you know, it's just a kind of a blank slate for the paranoid imagination to come up with any sort of activity you might imagine. And the other thing to me that was always the most interesting and maybe important aspect of the story is really from the level of Lincoln County and Glenn Campbell, who was busted for obstructing a police officer because he locked the doors of a TV van so it couldn't be searched without a warrant, and he was convicted. All the way up to Congress, the Pentagon, and the President. It's a story about democracy and what place secrecy has in a democratic society. The interceptors, people like Glenn Campbell, who have stormed the gates of Area 51 and of government secrecy, are basically doing it in the name of democracy. And whatever your perspective is on that will determine, I think how much you believe that a place like this should continue to function in such absolute secrecy as it does in the wake of the Cold War. So I'll stop talking there. I don't know how much time we have for questions, but maybe a few.
Yeah, I'm wondering about how many people work there, and it must be, what, 100 or so anyway? And how do they keep these people quiet? I mean, they must...
Yeah, it's more like... Yeah, it's more like between 1,000 and 2,000. Yeah, it's a really big place. Yeah, and basically people who work at facilities like this are required to take a security oath, where they, I said before, they're subject to 10 years in jail and a fine of $10,000 if they disclose classified information. Supposedly, if they even mention Area 51 by name. And I have talked to some people who it was obvious had worked at the base, but even though they were talking to me and telling me stuff about it, they still wouldn't admit that that's where they worked. They wouldn't say Area 51. They would just say, oh, let's just say it's a base that, in the desert that may or may not exist. So it's a pretty strong threat they have of a penalty, and they can lose their pensions. That's a big threat. What Bob Lazar says, people say, one of my questions was, well, if Lazar violated his security oath when he disclosed this classified information, why didn't they put him in jail? And his answer is, well, because then everyone knew I was telling the truth. But, anyone could say that about who's in any classified program. But Glenn Campbell said that one of his questions when he first moved there, and this is, a lot of people ask this, how could the government keep a secret as big as alien contact for 50 years, And Glenn said that he had that question too when he moved there. But after spending a couple of years around Rachel and around the border of Area 51 and trying to find out about it and talk to people, he concluded that they could keep a secret like that because security was so rigidly enforced and so effective. And the place is so big. The Nellis Air Force Range is as big as Switzerland. And it's the desert, so it's unpopulated. So it's a really good place for keeping secrets.
Among all the interviews you conducted individually, how did you determine, what were your criteria for determining first what were reliable sources, and secondly, what was credible evidence provided by resources?
Well, most of my information came from this group of people who call themselves the interceptors. You could call it secondary sources in that sense. Basically my feeling about them is the same criteria that they apply to people that they talk to, which is essentially just a kind of intuition. Talking to someone and just how do they strike you? Do they seem believable or not? Now, for a long time, they thought this guy, Bill Uhouse, was believable, a 70-year-old guy who said he worked in the secret saucer program. Uhouse never struck me as too reliable from the first time I met him, and it turns out in the end he kind of told a lot of fibs. But all of these things, basically the way that Glenn describes it is, he said the truth holds together over time, whereas lies and falsehoods fall apart on their own. If you collect enough stories and compare them to each other, the ones that seem to ring true and are consistent hang together, and the ones that aren't don't. But I have not interviewed hardly anyone who has actually worked at the base, or it's like when I ask people here who's been to Area 51, for all I know, there are people here who didn't raise their hand because they've worked at Area 51. But so I don't. I haven't had that much direct contact with these sources myself. I've gotten most of my information through the interceptors, and I apply my standards to their stuff the same way that they do to their sources. I did participate in one exercise where once these people became public figures, like Glenn Campbell and Tom LaHood and whatnot, they started, they were a focal point for receiving information themselves. So people would email them or get in touch with them and send them stuff saying, that this one example that I was going to tell you about is a guy said that he had worked at Los Alamos, I guess it was in the late 40s, early 50s, and that here at this particular technical area 33 of Los Alamos, there was a hangar built down in a canyon, and this is where was the underground entrance. There was a big hangar door where they took the recovered saucers. Okay, so I happened to be going to New Mexico at about that time, and so they said, "Oh, hey, you want to look for the secret saucer base?" I said, "Sure, why not?" So it would happen to be right next door to Bandelier National Monument, where you can camp on public land and look straight into that canyon. And so I just went with my binoculars and I looked down, and there was no evidence at all of any disturbance of the earth, certainly no big hangar door. And it's, that's the way these things kind of go, is that when you check out the stories yourself, they don't hold together too well. Same thing with Papoose Lake, where Bob Lazar says that he worked. If you look at satellite photos, there's no evidence of any land disturbance there. There's certainly no hangars, although Lazar says they were disguised to look like the desert. There's another place that Tom LaHood knows about, Area 19 of the Nevada test site, which he thinks is the really super secret place, where he heard tales of something that he calls the Cheshire Runway, because he heard stories of pilots who would be coming into this place, and they would have an assignment to land at this, certain coordinates, and they would come in, and they wouldn't see the runway until the last second because sprinklers would come on and show them, wet the pavement and show them where it was. But that's just, Tom is still trying to get into Area 19. It's a place that even on press tours, you can go almost anywhere at the test site except there. So that's still a place that holds some intrigue.
You sound rather suspicious of things, and like you go through your facts with a very discerning eye. And you're wearing an alien, and I'm really curious about what that means.
It's fun, It's just the way that I see it is it's just part of the spirit of the whole thing. So I've got a Dreamland patch, and I've got an alien face. It's all part of the same story. And that, to me, is a lot of what made this book so much so interesting to write, is that it has so many weird angles, and they're all entertaining. So I've learned a lot about aliens over the last couple of years. Even though I've never seen one, but the folklore of it again is I think you can enjoy folk tales and myths even if you don't necessarily believe them, And it's not, or even if you're agnostic, it's not a question of do I believe it or not. I still, people ask me if I believe in flying saucers or extraterrestrial. My answer is still, I don't know. The evidence seems to be, from what we've been able to see, that it's not true of Area 51, or at least they've really got it well hidden to the extent that, once you check it out, there's no evidence of it. But there's no evidence of any extraterrestrial life. There's all the UFO sightings that have been made, and there have been thousands. There's no evidence or physical proof for any of it. That doesn't mean that people didn't really see things, And there are some very convincing stories about things that have been tracked on radar by the Air Force and then disappeared that you can't explain. So, it's basically at this point, I remain an agnostic, on those questions.
Your opinion on Colonel Corso, the author of The Day After Roswell?
Yeah, a lot of people have asked me that, but I don't really have one. I haven't read that book. The book it's The Day After Roswell. Yeah, and this is the guy who, I think he says that, that our civilization got things like the laser and the silicon chip from the extraterrestrials. I don't know that much about Roswell. I was there for a signing last month, first time I'd ever been there. And I was at their museum, and I have to say that if you talk to people in Roswell very much, you'll come away a believer. I mean, there's so much, there's so much anecdotal evidence for that incident that it's pretty convincing. But I basically really had to limit myself. I'm not a ufologist. I'm not an expert on flying saucer lore in general. I mean, basically, I've just studied up on Area 51.
So you're alluding to that next year, the Congress is going to have to come around, perhaps the Supreme Court, to actually talk about Area 51 in an official manner. So are you saying that the government is sort of running out of moves, that the end game is near, and that they're going to have to come out and say something, and is that something going to be a whole other story itself?
Well, not necessarily, because the Supreme Court might find they could refuse to hear the case, in which case that would be that. Although, of course, the decision that happens before that at the Ninth Circuit Court level would determine what happens. Or if they consider the case, they could find that, in fact, it was a proper decision to keep these matters classified and that it does endanger national security and that therefore no information about the base will be released. So I don't think it's something like that they're coming to their end of the rope. It's more a, it's a legal question, although it's interesting to consider that, the various arms of the government, the judiciary and how much they're going to be influenced by the other aspects of political pressure in Washington, D.C. And this makeup of the Supreme Court is, a major factor. And one more question, anyone? Okay, no more questions. All right, well, thank you for your attention, and I'll sign any books for anybody who would like one.
Thank you very much, David Darlington. Area 51's the book, and if you'd like to come up along the side here if you want to ask me.